Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Satisfied Philosophy. Today I'm going to be reacting to this clip that came up between Gary Habermas and Mike Licona, discussing the creeds, the let's say alleged creeds in the New Testament about Jesus' resurrection and how these give very early attestation to Jesus' resurrection, right? So, um, at the end of this, I'm gonna sort of discuss what I think is a more honest um, dealing with the evidence rather than this very polemic and exaggerated and false confidence way of dealing with the evidence.
Habermas says that the earliest creedal testimony, he says most of the early creeds, this is outstanding. He says most of the creeds were probably in existence by 33 AD, and most of them originated in Jerusalem. Now,
so Bart Ehrman has never made that statement in any publication that I know. What Bart Ehrman says, I quote it in Grace Abounds when I discuss the resurrection. What Ehrman says is this is in his book How Jesus Became God on page 100. He basically somewhat concedes an early date. He says that it may well date to the earliest years of the Jesus movement, but I, in a very honest way, say, quote, Ehrman leaves it as an open question just how early the creed is, but he openly admits that the story of Jesus appearing to the 500 tracks back very early to the years following Jesus' death. So Ehrman is very fine with saying that, yeah, okay, we have these creeds within the first 10 to 15 years. 10 to 15 does not mean 33 AD. 10 to 15 can mean 45 AD, it can mean 43 AD. Ehrman doesn't give an exact date. Habermas has put these words into Ehrman's mouth as a means to try and display false confidence. This is something that a lot of apologists do. They display false confidence in attributing things that critical scholars never said to them as a means to try and make those critical scholars agree with them. Right? Ehrman never said this. And Habermas, even his fellow apologists have called him out for this, like Lydia McGrew. She has called him out for this, of totally misrepresenting. She thinks sometimes even knowingly misrepresenting critical scholars. I don't know if I'm going to say it's consciously dishonest, but it's definitely a sloppy engagement with the text he's reading. So Ehrman, and this is referring to the creed in probably 1 Corinthians 15. Maybe he's also referring to the creed in Philippians 2, but the main resurrection one for these guys is the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. And I mean, obviously, I think that creed is very good evidence for someone who already accepts the presuppositions involved with believing in a resurrected Jesus. So I think that's like a great piece of, I don't know, something to like meditate on and a source of maybe comfort. But we can't know how early it dates. There's some more recent work by this scholar named David Gregg in 2024, and it's a sort of a cognitive study of the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. And it does come to a similar view that like what we have here in these 5 to 7 verses, it's debated whether maybe some of the later bit is Paul's own insertion into the creed. But what we have here does seem to be early. We can know that from many different sources. So I do think the creed is early. Do I think it's 33 AD? Not necessarily. And there's no, I don't think there's any reason to think that it has to come from Jerusalem. And this is even more so the case in the creed in Philippians 2. Philippians 2 has that famous creed from verses 6 through 11. And I discuss this in Grace Abounds as I think that it is a universalist creed in many ways, right? The idea that all will confess homologestitai, future tense, all will confess. But I don't think that it dates to Jerusalem. As Fletcher Lewis discusses in this massive volume that if you want to say anything about the Creed and Philippians 2, you have to read, I would say, at this point. A lot of people are still trying to deal with how scholars are still trying to deal with how they receive his arguments, but what I will say is that it's very clear that Lewis has surmounted a strong argument in favor of both the Creed being early, the Creed teaching that Jesus is divine, so it does teach Jesus as divine in a very Platonic way, and so I would say that would support Habermas's arguments, but one thing that Lewis is very against is any attempt to try and trace this to an Aramaic original in Jerusalem. It's totally anachronistic. The Greek doesn't work, tracing it to Aramaic. I don't know Aramaic, but this is Lewis's view. He says the Greek doesn't work. A lot of other scholars agree. It's definitely the majority. So I think this is an empirically, one, I think it's an incorrect reading of Ehrman. Two, I think that it's a far more exaggerated statement we can make about the creeds. Last point I would make here before we continue is that the actually, I think we're fine to continue from here.
Just that's like 2 and 2 equals what? Most of the creeds are from Jerusalem, and they were in existence while Paul was persecuting the church.
So we said a lot of statements here that are just super questionable and controversial. The creeds are all from Jerusalem. No, absolutely not. Like I mentioned, it's a very minority position that the Philippians 2 creed is from Jerusalem. I think it's definitely not a majority position, nowhere near a super majority position that the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is from Jerusalem. I would say that there probably are more scholars who do hold that, just generally, which is more of a fair take because of the content itself. But no, I don't think all of the creeds are from Jerusalem, and Ehrman doesn't think that. And what I wanted to say earlier, which I forgot, is that something that Habermas does and a lot of apologists do is they're kind of stuck in like the 2000s scholarship, and so they see Bart Ehrman as like this like heavy hitter, most critical scholar critical can get. He's like super, up and up and on and making arguments that constantly question the consensus and this and that, and that's just not true anymore. Ehrman's publications in recent years have largely been literary studies. Ehrman himself is a textual critic. He's trained in that, and he's an excellent textual critic. Like his recent book, Between Heaven and Hell, tracing the different ideas of the Jesus' heralding of Hades throughout the years. I discuss a lot of that work in chapter 7 of Grace Abounds, if you're interested. But Ehrman is a textual critic, and his focus is not New Testament, and he will say this himself. Like it's not exegetical work in New Testament. He found a knack for that, especially in the popular eye, but he's never been considered a top tier exegetical critical scholar of the New Testament. And it's certainly not in the year of 2026. So I think it's it's interesting how Habermas will point to Ehrman, and many of the other apologists will do a similar thing because it doesn't seem that they know much about the critical state of New Testament scholarship other than Ehrman, right? There's obviously going to be no mention here of David Litwell, Robin Faith Walsh, people that are actually on the critical edge, Sarah Rowlands, Chris Keith, right, James Crossley, these people who are serious textual Jesus, historical Jesus exegetes, and there's not going to be any mention of them by these types.
This is so much. We have way more sources than we need, and the key is on the gospel, the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. They all taught the same thing. Fraud. There's no.
I mean, that's obviously just like super questionable. I mean, like I mentioned, Lewis has written this massive compendium of book to argue that Philippians 2 does in fact teach the deity of Christ, right? You had this very common view, I believe from James Dunn, and don't quote me on that, but it was the idea that Jesus in Philippians 2 is not depicted as a deity, but rather as a Superman. He's like a super Adam. He's the new Adam, which means he's like a Superman who's then exalted to deity at the end of the poem. And you have N.T. Wright, who responds to this. N.T. Wright and other similar people in that camp think that Jesus is depicted as divine at the start of the creed, but that he himself is not equal with God. He reads the verb arpago, which is like to seize, but he reads it to seize as like Jesus did not think it is just to seize the Father's position, and so N.T. Wright reads it that way. Fletcher gives the whole Lewis gives the whole reason why that's not a correct reading of arpazo. Sorry, not arpazo. Sorry, I messed the first verb up. But in either case, this is not at all something that people can agree on. I mean, when you look at 1 Corinthians 15, there's nowhere necessarily where Jesus is depicted as divine in 1 Corinthians 15. There's just absolutely nowhere. So this statement really is just kind of incoherent. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know how someone can come to that position, that all of these creeds necessarily teach the same thing. Let's even take the creed in Colossians. I believe Colossians 1 or 2. Colossians 1, 15 through 21, I believe. That creed also, number one, that creed is definitely not early, right? Colossians is a text written probably after Paul, probably late first century. That's not an early text. It may have been a creed recited by the people in the Colossian church, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but that doesn't mean it's an early creed. It definitely doesn't mean it dates to Jerusalem, and it definitely doesn't mean that it teaches the divinity of Christ necessarily. Though I do think there is a lot of good reason to think that Colossians does teach the divinity of Christ in that creed. So anyway, these are just more unfounded statements.
Apostle away. There's too many sources spread around the Mediterranean. They're all dying for the same reasons, and it's always the deity, death, resurrection. Habermas says
they're not always dying for the same reasons. We don't actually know what they died for, right? We have that. There's been a recent apologist who wrote a book discussing the martyrdoms of the apostles, and even so the guy Sean McDonald is his name. Sean McDonald wrote a book, and I believe the second edition came out about 2 years ago. And, it's a fine book. I think a lot of it's fine, but you can certainly see his apologetic inclinations in the text where he says things like, oh, we have no reason for and no reason against thinking that Matthew died of martyrdom, that Matthew was killed in some horrendous fashion. Obviously, any historian would say, okay, we don't have reason for this. Okay, then it's silence. We don't say that could or couldn't happen. We just say that there's no reason for it. You don't have to say there's no reason against. That is an apologetic move. That's a whole different point about Sean McDonald's book. But this, what he's doing right here is precisely that apologetic move. It's saying, okay, all these apostles died for this. I mean, I would say I'm no more confident. I mentioned this in Grace Abounds. Peter, Paul, James, maybe Thomas, probably Thomas, maybe Andrew. That's it. And my probably Thomas is questionable, right? So definitely Peter and Paul and James. We got three. You have three apostles who were I would say very likely killed in a tragic fashion. It's not a lot. It's definitely not all of them, and we don't know how exactly or why they died. So these are more just unfounded statements meant to install false confidence in the listeners who themselves are not very knowledgeable on this topic, and therefore they can soak this information in, leave thinking that these apologists have answered all of the questions in the world, and they no longer have to search for any more questions because, hey, it's answered right here. But the problem is that that's simply not how scholarship works. Anyway, and then the whole point about a fraud. Yeah, I mean, I obviously think that the fraud hypothesis to explain the resurrection is not correct. Yeah, obviously. So I mean, I agree with that point, but it's that's a silly Islamic and originally a Gnostic polemic from the second treatise of the Great Seth, and that was then later influenced Syriac sources, and then those Syriac sources eventually influenced the Quran. and then later Muslim polemicists who similarly argued, like the Gospel of Barnabas from the 14th century, where it says that Judas was crucified instead of Jesus, and this and that. Obviously, the fraud thing isn't true, but not a single critical scholar who's worth their salt believes that. So I don't even know the point of bringing it up. Anyway, I think I've responded to every single thing that has been said here. I think that in general, this sort of apologetic mindset is just totally foreign to, I think, how we should be dealing, how Christians should be dealing with questions about the resurrection. Right? It is a matter of faith. I mean, there's certainly a question of, okay, like you want to talk about how early our sources are. That does increase just general historical credence, right? But it's not a matter of proving something. You can't prove the resurrection happened. When Paul was asked about the resurrection, did Paul say, "Well, I can point to"? No, what Paul said is, it is something you just believe, and if you can't bring yourself to that, I would ask you to reread Paul again and allow his spirit through intercessory prayer to influence you to believe that. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and end this video. Go ahead, subscribe down below, like the video, and have a nice day.